Again. Okay. I'm really happy and honored to celebrate the book of Dr Shachar, a longtime fellow of the center and currently a member of its steering committee, all the more so with such a distinguished group of historians on our Zoom panel and with such a fine audience of colleagues and friends. CSoC is happy to celebrate every achievement and the publication of any book of our fellows. Nonetheless, it is especially fitting to discuss the publication of a book that is so up our alley as Uri's book. It deals with interreligious encounters, cross-cultural dynamics, border crossers and agents of connectivity, and intellectual exchange in and beyond shared spaces in a geographical and temporal setting that is at once, and from more than one perspective, a center and a periphery, the theme of our annual theme this year. While it is rich with theory and methodologically sophisticated, I will, by way of introduction, for the uninitiated in the study of the crusading era, cite a colorful and somewhat folkloristic depiction of its cultural exchange, the cultural exchanges in the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, written by my teacher of all things Frankish and much more, Benny Kedar. I hope you won't protest, Uri. So Kedar writes the following in 1996. The cultural history of the Frankish Levant, which has still to be written, sparkles with arresting figures. A wine-drinking Muslim poet, physician, and administrator who served first Frankish and then Muslim masters, writes a book on the coming of the Frank to the East, A siege expert from Jerusalem who claims to have destroyed many Saracen castles, puts his expertise at the disposal of Frederick Barbarossa and helps him to conquer a Lombard town. A hermit from Blois leaves Frankish territory to preach Christianity to a Muslim ruler, thereby prefiguring Francis of Assisi by a century. A Frankish king asks for non-scriptural proof of the resurrection of the flesh. A Jerusalem-born cleric who studies for 20 years in France and Italy before returning home writes a history of Muslim rulers based on Arabic sources. An Armenian archbishop, fascinated by the religiosity of some Frankish monks who settled near Antioch, sets out to translate the life and rule of Saint Benedict from the Latin into his native Armenian. An ophthalmologist who presents himself as de Jerusalem and exhibits familiarity with Salernitan lore as well as with several Arabic terms, advocates the use of embryonic tissue to enhance wound healing, thus anticipating a procedure produced in 1913. A Dominican friar returns to Acre from Damascus with a story originally told about an early Muslim mystic. So we're entering this type of world for the next an hour and a half or so, thanks to Uri's book and our three panelists. Multiple themes of this book interest me personally and intersect with my own research, but I will not abuse my position as chair any longer, especially taking account of our rich program for this evening. And I will call upon our first speaker, Professor Hein Haines, the founding father of the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters, and a constant friend and supporter of the center and all our activities, and the rector of Ben-Gurion University. Chaim, please.
Thanks very much, Daniela, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone here as we cross time zones. First and foremost, it's a real pleasure to, well, it would be nice if we went on screen, but I guess the screen, the virtual using Zoom and allows all of us to be in this, literally more or less in the same space together. For me, it's a great pleasure to be at an event which joins two of my favorite places in the university. The General History Department, which I've been a member for many, many years, and the Center for the Study of Conversion and Religious Encounters, which, as Daniela mentioned, I have some attachment to. It's even greater pleasure for me to able to say a few words about and to congratulate Uri on his book. As Uri is my fellow medievalist in the department, but also I still remember my first conversation with Uri many, many years ago in Philadelphia, where I realized after that conversation that whatever I did, I had to make sure that Uri came to Ben-Gurion University. And first it was via the center. Then also, thank goodness, my colleagues also in the history department realized that we wanted Uri, and Uri is now a very valued colleague and part of our department. I have no intention of talking about the book, as there are people here who are much more qualified than I am to do so. But I was really delighted, well, in a sense, delighted to see that Uri, in part of the book, or maybe I'm not even sure if he meant to do it, but he continues a conversation that I had started with, or that I had with an older colleague in the department who sadly is no longer with us, Professor Elena Lurie, also a medievalist, and a conversation that Uri basically continues and takes further. And that's has to do with something he mentions in the introduction about cultural borrowing. When he talks about the idea that the ribat might have been responsible for, or the thought, or the argument that the ribat might have been responsible for the emergence of the military orders in Christianity, an argument in the Christian world, during the Crusader period, an argument that was put forward and very much argued in a very interesting article by Elena Lurie, which caused a stir actually when it came out, and there was backwards and forwards with other people taking part in the in a very interesting discussion. Uri doesn't very much, as he says quite openly, doesn't like the idea of cultural borrowing. He, in the book, tries to move the argument forward to a more complex dialectic of sociological and theological dynamics. And I think what I've read of the book, he does a really, really interesting job. But it's nice to see a conversation started at Ben-Gurion University, continuing at Ben-Gurion University. I'd also like to say that I think it takes, it's very courageous of Uri to prepare to admit in the very last paragraph of his book, right, that his argument might have shortcomings. I think that's incredibly brave, and is a good example of the kind of historian that Uri is. And he suggests that there's still a need for new models for transformative contacts between communities. It seems to me that when he writes and says this, he's already looking forward to his next book, which I hope will be forthcoming in the not too far distant future. And I would like again to congratulate him and wish him all the best, and I look forward to many more years of fruitful cooperation, Uri. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Chaim. So our first speaker is Professor Elise Shagrir, Professor of Medieval History, and until recently, head of the Department of History, Philosophy, and Judaic Studies at the Open University of Israel. Elise specializes in social and cultural history, Christian-Muslim relations in the Middle Ages, Crusade studies, history of Jerusalem, liturgy, pilgrimage, and medieval naming patterns. She's also co-editor of the journal Crusades and is currently writing a book on liturgy and society in Latin Jerusalem. I'll mention her 4 books: Naming Patterns in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, published in Oxford 2003, Liturgy and Devotion in the Crusader States, edited with Cecilia Gapochkin, published in 2019, The Parable of the Three Rings and the Idea of Religious Toleration in European Culture, published it also in 2019, and a really wonderful textbook in Hebrew, The Crusades, History and Historiography, which already has a second edition for 2020, and I believe will be translated to English, right, Elise?
Hopefully, in the not too far future.
Well, it will. I'm sure it will benefit all. Okay, please.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for this very kind introduction. And first, I wish to congratulate Uri on the publication of his book, Pious Belligerence, and to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak today in this event celebrating this scholarly achievement of Uri's. So early on in his book, Uri presents the dominant paradigms in the study of the crusading era. He notes that historians of the Crusades have often conceived, the history of the Crusades has often been conceived through notions of opposition and exclusion, and that despite having been critiqued since the 1990s, these notions have proved remarkably persistent. He adds that although scholars, he mentions Elmblum, McCavitt, Paul Cobb, and others, have attempted to destabilize these assumptions, they remain steadfast. Historians, not to mention the general public, have tended to view intercommunal contacts in the East as rare and restricted to specific circumstances such as political subordination, diplomacy, religious conversion, and the occasional overlap in ritual space. While many of us recognize the importance of deconstructing traditional perceptions and have done so in our work and writing, present panel and company in general included, it is also evident that it is much easier to change prevailing perceptions if one replaces them with alternative constructions. By drawing a nuanced picture of the interfaith relations in a medieval Levant, and by providing alternative constructions, the book we are celebrating today does much to amend the traditional picture. It is revealing, therefore, that the word violence appears only 7 or 8 times in the body of the book. The discussion of dialogical warfare and the rhetoric of righteousness in the crusading Near East, as the book's subtitle has it, subscribes to the scholarly approach that foregrounds more constructive contacts over violent clashes between West and East during this period. To be sure, clashes and violence were there, but the emergent picture of the medieval Outremer is not an overly rosy one in this book or elsewhere. Nonetheless, nuances are important. In privileging questions of influence and assimilation, this study upholds the notion of exchange between different traditions. This exchange has, as we learn in the introduction, an, quote, enduring spatial and intellectual coherence, end of quote. This perception, not an entirely new one in the current context, is very well regarded. According to it, the relative tolerance of the kingdoms of Jerusalem and Acre towards non-Latins and other minorities, and the lack of interest in homogenizing the population created a space of multicultural crossroads and interconfessional neighboring where it was possible to exchange ideas and literary traditions. As suggested in the book, such an attitude created, quote, a dynamic cultural entanglement. Pious Belligerence makes a singular contribution to this thesis. First, it investigates the cross-cultural trajectories that affected central themes and ideas such as holy warfare, chivalry, eschatology, purity, women and sexuality, and shows how these tropes served as conduits of cross-cultural literary spaces. And second, it sets out to overcome Eurocentricity and to develop models that represent Christianity as the transcultural and diverse religion it was and is. In this short talk, my discussion arises from one of the chapters in the book, the fascinating chapter 3, entitled Warrior Mothers, the co-production of pious chivalry in Romance literature. There, Uri provides a keen analysis of the treatise Histoire d'Outre-mer et de la naissance de Saladin, History of Overseas and the Birth of Saladin, an anonymous work of history and fiction covering the period from 1099 to 1230. In Uri's reading, this treatise constructs a particular notion of chivalry of Outremer, of the chivalry of Outremer. It does so by weaving together an established framework of crusader narrative along with interpolated anecdotes that extol the military prowess of Saladin. Uri analyzes the image of chivalry as it emerges from an anecdote that tells the story of the daughter of the Count of Ponthieu, la fille du Comte de Ponthieu. For the fantastic details, you'll have to go back to the book, but here I just provide a brief summary. In this peculiar story, Saladin is imagined as a descendant of a French noble dynasty, the love child of a beautiful Christian princess and a Muslim ruler. By making Saladin the product of this mixed marriage, the narrative ushers in a new way of thinking about past chivalry, one that accords Saladin and the Frankish knights of Outremer equal agency in the formation of holy and just war. In other words, the Christian idea of holy war appears in this fable as an idea that is co-produced genealogically and ethically by Christianity and Islam, both. Moreover, the existence of a half-Christian Saladin somehow seems to relax the clash of civilizations between these two religions. And here I'm just going to share one of the images that appears in Uri's book, but here you can see it in color rather than in black and white as it is in the book. And we see a nice visualization of this idea in an image from the Histoire d'Outre-mer that depicts Saladin as wearing a crown and riding a steed, looking a lot like French royalty. This depiction diminished the authority of the Muslim Sultan and championed his virtues. So I'll just stop share now. Did you see it? Yeah, could you see it?
No, it didn't.
Oh, I'm sorry. So again, now, I think I'm not host actually. Never mind.
Wait, I'll turn you. You're co-host, so I'll turn you into.
It's not that important if it takes time.
No, but you should be able to.
I think I was co-host in the beginning, but now I'm not. So let me see. Now you can see it, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So here is Saladin in one of the images, illuminations in the Histoire d'Outre-mer. And he's riding a horse, very much like a French royalty. And as I said, that depictions like this diminish the authority of the Muslim Sultan and championed his virtues by likening him to French royal figures. So here we go again. So now I would like to draw attention to a second anecdote included in this exceptional text, the Histoire d'Outre-mer. It is another story about Saladin, which adds a special zest to the traits attributed to the Muslim ruler in later medieval literature. While European literature ascribed to Saladin a series of qualities that includes his noble ancestry, piety, military prowess, wisdom, and courtesy, here an additional aspect of his character makes an appearance, the questioning of religious truth. Like many other interpolated anecdotes, this one also starts with the words "Or vous direz," in French, I will now tell you, an opening that indicates a speaking voice and likely an oral source. We hear of Saladin's faith quest. On his deathbed, he summons the leaders of the three great religions in the area, namely the Jewish sages of Jerusalem, the Caliph of Baghdad, and the Christian Patriarch of Jerusalem, hoping to discover, before he departs from this world, the best religion. The three religious representatives make their cases, but because Saladin does not disclose his decision, the listener or reader is left wondering about the truth. Actually, later versions of this legend have Saladin even baptized and dying as Christian, but not here. As Uri suggests in his book, page 96, compositions such as the Histoire d'Outre-mer invoke the figure of Saladin in order to extol, and perhaps in some cases to exonerate, Christian knighthood by associating it with the Saracens' chivalry. Over the centuries, Western audiences of such works have reveled in the idea that although the Sultan has dealt a fateful blow to the crusading endeavor in the East, he was ostensibly enchanted by Christian ethics of knighthood and sought to draw close to it. My addition is a further and perhaps even bolder suggestion that such anecdote provided a way to present Saladin as likewise intrigued by the Christian faith and seeking to learn more about it. And in doing so, he or his literary figure disclosed his own uncertainty. By presenting Saladin's figure as intrigued by the enemy's faith, he is imagined as a more benign enemy. Such a representation, moreover, reflects back on the perception of Christian knighthood of Outremer as prone to curiosity about the other side and capable of conversation with the enemy. I believe that my proposal regarding this aspect of Outremer knighthood sits well with Uri Shachar's main argument that within the Near Eastern context, anecdotes of fabulous encounters between members of different religions, as recounted in the Histoire d'Outre-mer, constitute a genre of narratives that reproduce the Holy Land and the Eastern Mediterranean as a site of, quoting Uri, codependence and sharing of a cultural space. Such narratives provide a new opportunity for thinking about the kinds of cultural interactions and exchanges possible in the Holy Land. So what does the notion of religious curiosity, quest, or uncertainty, which appears in this anecdote, but is not anecdotal, add to the image of Western chivalry? First, it is important to remember that doubt is not synonymous with unbelief or even lack of conviction. Instead, it can indicate indecisiveness or deliberation. Moreover, doubt is not necessarily a negative feature. For example, in scholasticism, it is the basis for rational thinking. In one's final fragile moments, however, a scenario not unknown to Outremer knights, this introspection should be seen in the context of the rise of the mentality of doubt. In his seminal discussion of doubt in Christendom, Gavin Langmuir writes, and I paraphrase, that when people begin to think about their faith and to formulate their beliefs, that process is accompanied and is often impelled by the knowledge that not everyone believes as they do and that their beliefs may be rejected by others. As a consequence, they themselves may experience doubt. The encounter with other beliefs, or more precisely with people who believe differently, is thus the crux of the matter. Doubt in this line of thinking derives from the appeal of competing faiths and all religions. The genre of secular literature and the hybrid figure of Saladin, portrayed as a Christian knight, might have been a convenient channel to convey the idea that the right way to serve God might be unknowable, or that we are at risk of choosing the wrong way, something we do not want to discover after death. Religious doubt could, and often was, condemned by the Catholic Church, but it could also be narrated in a benign context. This is not the time or place to delve into the development of the mentality of doubt in Western civilization, medieval civilization, but that study is enriched by our little anecdote, especially when doubt is linked to a figure conceived as a valorous Christian knight as Saladin. Such thinking penetrated the minds of Latin Christians in various subtle ways, one of which is exemplified in the Histoire d'Outre-mer. As Uri shows in his discussion, and as I have tried to demonstrate here briefly, These literary creations were fertile sites for testing hybrid figures and new ideas born out of the cultural encounters of Outremer. And as Uri reminds us, we should strive to approach this interaction as neither naively appreciative nor stubbornly bellicose. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Elise. We will move to our next speaker, Luke Yarbrough, an associate professor in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. Luke's research interests include interreligious relations, Hadith studies, Arabic historiography, pre-modern state administration, and manuscript studies. I will mention his two books, Friends of the Emir, Non-Muslim State Officials in Pre-Modern Islamic Thought, Cambridge 2019, and the earlier Sword of Ambition, Bureaucratic Rivalry in Medieval Egypt, New York 2016. Luke has also edited two important volumes, Minorities in Contact in the Medieval Mediterranean, published in 2020, and a book we had celebrated several months ago in this very forum, Conversion to Islam in the Pre-Modern Age, which was published also in 2020, co-edited with our Nimrod Horvitz and Uri Simonson, we will be happy to hear you now again, Luke, this time about Uri's book, please.
Thank you very much, Daniela. Can everyone hear me okay? It's a great honor to be here. I'd like to thank the organizers and express my pleasure at being on hand to celebrate Uri and to thank him above all for writing this book for us to congratulate him on and talk about. This coming autumn will mark a decade since Uri and I first met at the Katz Center in Philadelphia, which Chaim already mentioned. I believe our first conversation was about none other than the title of this book, Pious Belligerence, which was also the title of Uri's project at the time, and with which I was very taken then and remain very taken now. So it's very satisfying to be continuing this conversation with you. I want to get to Uri's terrific book via a story that Daniela already mentioned, quoting Benny Kedar, I think. To do that, I want to share an image that is decidedly not medieval. Can everyone see this image? So this is the 8th century Muslim female mystic Rabel Adawiyah, Qaysiyah. And as the token Islamicist here, I thought I'd mention her. She spent her rather simple but ecstatic life in Basra, Iraq, where she died in the early 9th century. And a story is told about her by the 13th century Sufi, Jalaluddin Rumi. In the story, she's seen running along with a torch in one hand and a pitcher of water in the other. And people ask her, Rabel, where are you going? She says, I'm taking this torch and I'm going to set fire to paradise and burn it down. Then I'm going to take this water and go to hell and put out the fires there so that people will not worship God out of hope of paradise or fear of hell, but instead out of pure love for God. And for our purposes, the interesting thing about this story is that the first Muslim source to mention it is the Persian work of a 14th century Sufi of Anatolia named Aflaki, who died in 1360, more than 5.5 centuries after Rabia. To my knowledge, maybe some of you, the learned people here, have found other earlier attestations, and I'd love to learn about them. But this is not the first account that we have to tell the story of the woman and the torch and the bucket. The French chronicler Jean de Joinville, who lived half a century before Aflaki, tells virtually the same story about an old woman whom a Christian friar encountered near Damascus in the mid-13th century. And we don't know really why or how this story got into the life of St. Louis, Joinville's text, But what's interesting is that this old French source is the earliest source we have for the tale of the Muslim woman, the torch, and the bucket, which has come to be closely associated in Muslim popular imagination with the figure of Rabia. Now, before reading Uri's book, I would have been inclined to call this a rare and unusual, rather outré coincidence, but it's one of the many merits of a pious belligerence to upend widely held assumptions about the overlap and interpenetration of neighboring literary and devotional traditions, like the assumptions I would have been making. And now that I've read the book cover to cover, the traveling tale of the torch and the bucket no longer seems quite so exceptional to me. To be sure, as Chaim already pointed out, this is not a book merely about plot lines and literary devices that are borrowed or that travel or that pop up in some other way in multiple languages or literary genres. It digs much deeper than that. It's not a simple story of cultural borrowing between static and clearly demarcated cultural or linguistic blocks, far from it. And if the book only ranged widely among popular epic, exhortatory sermons, historiography, praise poetry, apocalypse, that would have been enough. But that it does so across at least 4 languages, setting its literary history against the background of contemporary political developments makes it, in my opinion, a real breakthrough in the study of medieval literary thought worlds, and especially in the study of the Eastern Mediterranean in the era of the Crusades, which can sometimes be a rather dusty and conservative field. Uri's argument pertains to the period following the reconquest of Jerusalem by Saladin in 1187. This event shattered the relatively stable bipolar political arrangement that Uri tells us had set in after the successes of the First Crusade. Over the next century, he suggests warring factions of Arabic-speaking Muslims, European Christian Franks writing in Latin and French, Old French, and European Jews writing in Hebrew all came to employ a mutually intelligible repertoire of language and symbols and imagery in their literary productions. Crucially, this was an era of political fragmentation. It witnessed frequent shifting alliances, exchanges of allegiance, and general ambiguity in the identifications and loyalties of major protagonists. And Uri, for instance, uses to great effect the story of the Battle of La Forbie, or El Harbiya in 1244, which saw the Christian Franks and Syrian branch of the Ayyubid family arrayed side by side in battle against the Egyptian Ayyubids and Khwarezmians. The Syrian Muslims reportedly marched into battle under the standard of the cross. So strikingly transgressive scenes like this one preface the literary accounts that Uri reveals to us in detail in the successive chapters of the book. And in a subtle way, I think he suggests that the zeitgeist of border crossing and ambiguity of this later Crusades period in the Eastern Mediterranean set the stage for literary motifs to follow suit. The sermons of Jacques de Vitry in the early 13th century surprisingly valorize what he calls the guise, the idiom, and the prestige of Muslim enemies. As Elise already told us, we learn how female figures or these warrior mothers were deployed as potent, productive sites of cultural ambiguity and hybridity that underlie ideals of pious chivalry. Literally, they co-produce the lineages of heroes such as Saladin and the Mamluk Sultan Baybars. A large group of French Jews who arrive in Akko in 1211, taking part in what Uri calls somewhat provocatively a Jewish crusade. Although they're unarmed and demographically minuscule, they produce a literature that imagines a messianic militant conquest of the land, very much in tune with the violent fantasies of their Christian and Muslim contemporaries. And Jews, Christians, and Muslims alike spoke freely the language of militant purification of the Holy Land, often rhetorically employing the blood of their enemies as a cleansing agent. But they didn't merely share these themes and devices. Again, this is not a story of culturally static blocks happening to sort of do the same things within their own ambits. They also came to depend upon their imaginings of one another through these retellings of their own stories for their own senses of who they were and who they strove to become as zealous antagonists. Now, Personally, I have to say, Uri, that some of my favorite parts of the book were those that I think may be underappreciated by some other readers. And I mean here the philological spadework and the genuinely new textual discoveries that Uri has made. He skillfully unravels the layers of a key text in the William of Tyre tradition, the Histoire d'Outre-mer, to trace the setting of its compilation in the later Latin East, in Akko to be specific. Likewise, he brings to light new manuscripts of key Hebrew apocalypses from libraries in Parma and Oxford, among others, that place our understanding of the text's elaboration on new footings. And throughout, the book is carefully attuned to the subtle word level and phrase level changes that were introduced by 12th and 13th century writers when they were adapting earlier scriptural and late antique literary models to their own historical moments. Uri makes very productive, skillful use of these subtle textual shifts. I think these philological advances do a really nice job of grounding the literary and cultural historical insights that the book advances in those other sections that I suspect will be more commonly assigned to students and quoted frequently by other scholars, alongside the works of the figures with whom the book is in dialogue, like David Nirenberg, Carla Mallet, and Sharon Kinoshita. I want to end with three sort of broad questions that the book raised for me. Naturally, I don't expect you, Uri, to address them today, but I do, coming back to the beginning, I do want to express the hope that we'll get another decade's worth of conversations out of these queries and others like them, inspired by this potent device of pious belligerence that you have so skillfully assembled. So my first question is whether any number of other major literary themes or families of motifs could be studied also as co-productions of adjacent and intertwined literary cultures. So is belligerence or pious belligerence, what makes it kind of unique? Is it valuable as an example mainly because of the contrast it offers between antagonism on the one hand and literary intimacy on the other? Could you otherwise have got similar mileage out of, say, figurations of peace? Or is belligerence and combative motifs special in some other way? That's question number one. The second is, I'm wondering what might have been distinctive about the period of the later Latin East, if we zoom out on kind of a macro historical scale. Obviously, the region in general, the Holy Land in particular, have seen countless adjacent, antagonistic, entangled peoples from the ancient Near East on down. So I know it's a bit out of the wheelhouse of the book, but I'm wondering if we should assume that people kind of always and habitually trade literary topoi with each other on the weekends while they're busy plotting to bash each other's brains out during the week? Or do you think that there was something really sui generis about this moment? On this note, I wasn't something we can argue about eventually. I wasn't 100% convinced that the early and mid 11th century was quite so kind of stable and polarized as you describe, and thus so unhospitable to the transgression of boundaries. But even if you're right about this and my suspicion is wrong, there were certainly other moments, even just in the medieval history of the Holy Land, that saw comparable levels of multipolarity and shifting alliances. The 11th century, for instance, comes to mind, although there you don't have, obviously, the Frankish presence. Last question. The book made me wonder, sort of at a more of a macro historical remove, but here with regard to causation, I'm wondering why exactly this co-production of literary language and images and themes happened. What were the economic and sociological processes underlying it, maybe? I mean, I'm entirely convinced by the book that it happened. I think the evidence is overwhelming. What's less clear to me is how we ought to plot the etiology. For instance, was this an example of the formation of a new cross-confessional elite culture? Something like Chaim already alluded to, horse warriors from East and West, discovering that they have a lot in common with each other. The medieval global elites Davos types of hommes lettres whose legitimacy in the eyes of their tax-paying subjects depends on their ostentatious efforts to kill each other, but they come to realize in some inchoate way that they actually have a great deal in common with fellow elite horse warriors, infidels though they be. And even perhaps, as in the story of the warrior mothers, that they share biological parentage. And I was struck in this regard that a lot of the key figures in the book were newcomers or outsiders to the Holy Land. We hear relatively little, for instance, from local Jewish or Christian populations. Or was the major phenomenon that the book detects instead the result of kind of literary adjacency and osmotic exchange? Thoroughly mixed populations give rise to literary cultures in which scholars and belletrists were in steady contact and more or less naturally absorbed resonant themes from their week in, week out conversations. So these were some of the thought processes that the book set in train for me, and I look forward very much to continuing the conversation. And once again, I warmly congratulate you, Uri, on this great achievement. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Luke. Uli, I hope you're noting down the, yeah, I trust you are. Okay. But before you'll have a chance to respond, I'm happy to invite our third speaker, Nicholas Paul, an associate professor of history and director of medieval studies at Fordham University. And this is also not the first time we meet with Nick and with people from Fordham, and I hope we will continue this tradition of cooperation between our center and your institution, Nick. His 2012 book, To Follow in Their Footsteps, The Crusades and Family Memory in the High Middle Ages, was awarded the John Nicholas Brown Prize of the Medieval Academy of America. He has also co-edited with Susan Yeager, Remembering the Crusades, Myth, Image, and Identity, and with Laura Moriel, The French of Outremer, Communities and Communications in the Crusading Mediterranean. Most recently, with a group of Fordham colleagues, Nick edited Whose Middle Ages? Teachable Moments for an Ill-Used Past, which I'm looking forward to read and perhaps put to use. Now working on the publication and translation of the 13th century, How the Holy Cross was Brought from Antioch to the Monastery of Braun. Nicholas Paul also directs the several digital humanities projects, including the Oxford Outremer Map, the Independent Crusaders Project, and the Siege of Antioch project. And I'm really grateful that you found time for us, Nick, and for commenting on Uri Shachar's book. Please.
Thank you very much. Iris, I see you're raising your hand. Do you want to say something? No? Hello?
Sorry, I meant to cheer Luke and thank him.
Okay, sorry.
Okay,
yes, cheers, Luke, for me too. Okay, as going last and the last person to talk about this book means that I have to echo many of the sentiments of what people have said previously in this conversation, and also we've talked about some of the same themes and the same examples and even the same manuscripts and stories have already come up in this discussion. So I hope that what I say is going to I'll try and edit it to fill in some of the gaps that are left over. But I was going to begin by saying that, I mean, even if some of the same things struck us, I think that it's impossible for even this group of scholars, several people, several specialists on the period and place that the book covers, coming together, bringing together different forms of knowledge and across many different time zones to capture actually the sum total of all of the contributions that are in this book. large and small, and that really make up the larger contribution of the book. Some of the book's contributions, I would add, are very large indeed. And here I refer to the book's epilogue, which recasts 2 centuries of scholarship on intercultural and interconfessional dialogue across the Mediterranean world, drawing heavily on the literature from Iberia, as well as what has been written about the Crusades in the Near East, up to and beyond the New Philology. Citing Sharon Kinoshita and Carla Millett, the book, as has been pointed out, remarkably closes questioning whether a suitable intellectual apparatus yet exists to perform the kind of work we need to do to interrogate the eclecticism and confusion of the crusading context. To answer that question, we might turn to books. We might turn to the book's smaller contributions. By smaller, I don't mean minor. What I mean is that each chapter of the book presents a new set of texts produced in or associated with the Eastern Mediterranean littoral in the 13th century. Many of these texts, for instance, the Histoire d'Outre-mer that's been mentioned, the Sirat Barbars, or the Hebrew text in Darmstadt manuscript 25, are themselves major works. But here, they receive close scrutiny that they've long deserved. Many of them are really neglected in our field. But they're also, not only are they receiving this close scrutiny for the first time, they're also being dramatically repositioned to give them new and more appropriate contexts, and also to show, if not their direct engagement with one another, the debts that they owe to the larger shared cultural context of the Latin East. Uri sums up this approach as follows. He says, whether in sermons, homilies, prose fictions, or poems, authors in the Near East engaged with each other by self-consciously invoking themes with a history in their own traditions, but that also enjoyed important prestige in the traditions with which their works shared a space. And I'm going to come back to some of the key elements of that sentence in a moment, the prestige in which they shared space. But I would posit that in this book, every time this approach is deployed, it pays tremendous dividends. Each reading puts forward novel interpretations that are important, and I truly believe that virtually every discrete discussion of a primary text here will warrant its own future scholarly response and discussion. I can see discrete lines of inquiry kind of following out, not only from the book as a whole, but actually from each of these interventions. So I guess then I see the answer to Uri's closing question as a resounding yes. Not only does a suitable intellectual apparatus exist, the book is in fact its blueprint. And I would suggest that we all adopt it to the best of our linguistic abilities. But I also want to meditate on the specific power of Uri's turn of phrase, the enjoyment of prestige, for a moment. And this brings me to a more particular reading of this remarkable book. I think it's a great turn of phrase, the enjoyment of prestige, because I kind of hope that's what we're doing. That's what you're doing right now, Uri, as well as something we're all contemplating. I come to this book and this discussion from a decidedly old-fashioned position of a Crusade historian trained in a European and Eurocentric perspective towards the Crusades. And I should hasten to add that that's no fault of my teacher, who is much better at this than me. My expertise is on precisely the antiquated terminologies and approaches that Uri here so eloquently and effectively dismantles and reorients. The debt that I then owe to the book is much greater than most. I will never understand or teach or write about the codification of warrior virtues and class consciousness that Euro-medievalists know as chivalry in around the year 1200 in the same way again. And I'll briefly explain why, just using one kind of example from the book. In the second and mainly in the third chapter of A Pious Belligerence, Uri rediscovers and repositions the work we've already heard a little bit about, known as the Histoire d'Outre-mer. Iris has offered a great sort of explanation of what that was. The narrative of the history of the Latin East that is included in Histoire d'Outre-mer, which also includes these details of the life of Saladin, also has these two important sub-narratives. And Iris mentioned the one called the Fille du Comte de Ponthieu. But there's another one, in addition, called the Ordre de Chevalerie, that has long existed, and this whole compilation, of course, has long existed in the footnotes of studies of Old French histories of the crusading frontier, and always, as Uri points out, has been effectively disregarded. But the larger, although the larger work is poorly known and little studied, this discrete section, the Ordre de Chevalerie, is very well known and well studied by historians of European knighthood and chivalry. And that's because, along with the Roman des Ailes, it constitutes one of the earliest signs of the emergence of a sacred, noble order of knighthood as a distinct social class of its own. Now, this story is the story of a group of Frankish knights taken prisoner by Saladin and asked to introduce him to the ways of knighthood. The reader is thus led through the entire ritual of the ordination into knighthood, each stage of which and each symbol of which is explained in the form of a classic dialogical instructional text. In one of the main versions of this text, I would say the version that is the best known to scholars of chivalry and knighthood, it ends when the Frankish knight, and sorry, I actually can share here. I can also share an image from the same manuscript. There we go. It ends. So here is Saladin seated, wearing his crown, as Iris says, giving him, and his clothing, giving him a sort of the appearance of a European sovereign. And he's talking to these captured knights, and he's asking them to explain chivalry. And at the very end of the story, in the independent version that's not in the Histoire d'Outre-mer, Saladin asks whether he can be made, now that he knows all of this information, whether now he can be made a knight. But Hugh de Tabary, our sort of protagonist interlocutor, refuses in this external version of the story, refuses to do so. However, in the version of the story found in Histoire d'Outre-mer, we find a completely different ending. And to my knowledge, Uri Shachar is the first scholar to draw attention to the significance of this alternate version and its placement within the Histoire d'Outre-mer. In this version, Hugh does fulfill Saladin's request. He delivers the accolade, the blow of the flat of the blade, to Saladin and exclaims, "God makes you a prud'homme," using the most powerful word for the invocation of membership in this elite class. And this is only one of several elements of the Histoire d'Outre-mer that Uri discusses, the other being the Vie de Comte de Ponthieu and the Saladin material, which I think he convincingly argues makes this entire compilation, including the story, depend upon the unique circumstances of the Latin East. Now, this question of how the text depends on those circumstances and how it participates in a kind of process of co-production is, of course, gets to the heart of the kind of work, the kind of research that Uri is doing in his book. I wanted to point out that the question of where texts belong geographically, to which sort of tradition they belong geographically, has also been a concern that we've had at Fordham in some of our projects. And I remember when Uri visited Fordham, and we talked about this project, the French of Outremer, which was an attempt to catalog all of the texts written in Old French in the Eastern Mediterranean in the kind of crusading context. And I think I probably naively at that time was asking questions like, "Oh, do you think that was written in the Near East? Do you think that was written in the Latin East?" And one of the things that I think his book really powerfully does is show that those are sort of some of the wrong questions, only to ask where something is written down, what linguistic features it shares, if we can look beyond that and think about the dependence of the narrative and its elements on these Latin Eastern contexts. So over the coming years, I think historians of European society, and particularly elite culture, will have to take into account the significance of Uri's discoveries with regard to this text, for instance, but also other ones. Is it simply the pious chivalry of the crusading East that is co-produced by the confusion and juxtaposition of literatures and cultures in the Eastern Mediterranean, or must we cast our net more broadly? This particular text and other Frankish works that he considers, for instance, all circulated very widely and are mainly known to us through copies that were made in Western Europe. So where does the co-production end once these themes, motifs, and stories are unleashed within the literary traditions that move not only within the Near East, but also far, far beyond the Near East? And if so, I guess this also follows up on questions that were put much more eloquently by Luke. Are the texts themselves reflections of co-production or agents of co-production? And where does that process take us? So these are questions that I hope we can pursue here a little bit, but I very much look forward to also following Uri's work in the future to see how he follows up with these questions in his own scholarship, and also just to say that again that these readings and these possibilities that are produced here really are paradigm shifting for the kinds of work that I do and that many scholars of the Crusades, the Latin East, and also of European medieval culture do. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Uri, I guess it's your turn. Chatana Simcha. I'll introduce you and then please respond to whatever questions and comments you've heard. And I hope we will still have a few minutes for our audience to chip in as well. So Uri Shachar is Associate Professor of Medieval History at Ben-Gurion University and a member of the Center for the Study of Conversion and Interreligious Encounters. He was first a PI of a project entitled The Dialogical Context of Near Eastern Polemical Literature. And now, as you've heard, he's a member of our steering committee. Uri has held fellowships at the University of Pennsylvania, Fordham University, and Harvard University, and he's already working on his following book project on the consequences of multilingualism in the Eastern Mediterranean. And it is his monograph we are celebrating today. I'll use the opportunity to add my own congratulations to those you've already heard for this extremely learned and rich study, and give you the opportunity to say a few words orally now, please.
Thank you so much, Daniela. I'd like to thank you and first of all, thank you and Raya for organizing this lovely event tonight, and the center, of course. And I'd like to thank the speakers for their really very generous depictions of my book, which is a reminder that they themselves, as well as other people who are here tonight, were part of its making, of its conversations and thinking. And I thank the speakers for the reminder that in writing these kinds of books, there is a certain gratification that is sometimes is easy to forget. The gratification of creating this conversation and receiving a tangible proof that it can yield a profitable conversation like the one that we're having tonight, and hopefully other conversations in the future. I'm also reminded in through your very generous comments that this book too is a result of a tradition that is the result that is a long-standing conversation and dialogue. First and foremost, a dialogue with our, so to speak, forefathers, some of whom were mentioned in person: Beni Kedar, Ilana Luria, Jonathan Riley Smith, and we can go further back to the French and German forefathers of our field and the methodologies that prescribe the way we think about problems and texts that are on our desks. This reminds me, or brings me to the thought that the sense in which one recognizes, or the circumstances that allow one to recognize that one's own thought are the product of a conversation with obvious and less obvious interlocutors, which I hope is what this book is about, and also are there circumstances that made this book possible. Like Elise said in a different context, demands a certain curiosity, but also doubt and introspection. And in fact, it also demands another attribute that Elise thinks about at depth in her new book that Daniela mentioned, the book about the three rings and the history of the idea of toleration. It also demands a sense of skepticism. And the fact that the anonymous author of the text that was mentioned so many times tonight, Des Soirs d'Outre-mer, the fact that this anonymous author thinks about Saladin as someone who reflects on the question of religious toleration, or the legitimacy of other faiths, through a gesture of doubt and skepticism, is a very bold move. It's very courageous. I mean, it's generous, but also courageous. So, and it is noteworthy that this author felt comfortable attributing this characteristic to this figure, Saladin, and not as a way of minimizing his person or his figure, but rather celebrating the kinds of characteristics that he associated with chivalry, generosity, piety. So this, I think, is noteworthy, and in a way speaks to the circumstances that make this co-production possible. Obviously, other circumstances where religious encounters are simply not historically possible, or where the kind of paradigms or the kinds of restrictions don't allow for these kinds of thought, it is hard to believe that something like that would have been attributed to, or this kind of gesture would have been attributed to a figure that one wants to celebrate. So this is, I think, speaks to the kinds of possibilities that were existing in the Near East. So I wanted to address the other ideas or questions that Luke and Nick mentioned. Luke talked about or asked whether the notion of co-production, which I offer as an alternative paradigm to the notions of borrowing and other kinds of ways in which we think about exchange, whether it is one that is profitable in thinking about belligerence, or existed in thinking about belligerence more than in other themes or categories. And I'm tempted to say that that it's not exclusive to belligerence. And the reason I chose this one is because it was the one that is most, where the stakes are highest in our field, in the way we think about these texts, in the history in which we we approach them and the reason why they're important in the for our readers and the consequences of what we write. And in fact, as the title of my hopefully not too far away next monograph, The Consequences of Multilingualism, is an attempt to trace the way authors thought about the history of their own languages and what it meant to use them through motifs and ideas that they encounter in their neighboring traditions. So what I think to a certain extent, I think for some of the readers of this current book, I think the fact that Jews who immigrated to Akko too also relied on the notion of holy belligerence is something that captured what I try to do, captures what I try to do, because we rarely associate Jews who make aliyah, pilgrimage to the Holy Land, with this kind of imagery, and yet they do. So this means to me that this vocabulary, these gestures were efficacious for what they're hoping to convey. In the same way, I find, or I hope to convey or to convince in this next project that the fact that authors of works in Arabic, in so to speak vernacular Arabic, which is to say the siyar material, also think about or rely on strategies of justifying their use of Arabic through thinking about this language as one that is in motion and that crosses seas and lands, and that reveals its presumption to bear truth through this crossing, is something that is surprising, because we often, it's easier to convince, or it's easier to expect that writers of French in the Eastern Mediterranean would resort to these kind of strategies because their own language, in fact, traveled across the sea. And they think about it as a language and a culture that is across the sea, outre-mer. But why would authors of Arabic resort to the same strategies? To me, this is a sign that these notions are co-produced. They are the result of these kinds of cultures that are in contact, and if anything, they're borrowing strategies, not necessarily ideas as such, or categories as such. Luke, your second comment reminded me of the very successful Asterix volume that talks about the conquest of Britain, where they say that the reason the Romans, Caesar, was able to conquer so quickly and efficaciously the island is because the Britons would always stop at, what was it, 4 or 5 o'clock to have tea, and they never fight on the weekends. And so what the Romans did simply is to begin fighting at 4 o'clock and only Saturday and Sunday, and therefore very soon afterwards the deal was done. So I wonder whether it made me laugh whether these kinds of exchanges are the things that happen. You fight in the morning, and then in the afternoon you meet in the pub and you exchange these ideas and think about how really the bloodshed that took place in the morning was in fact co-produced. Who would have known? But why was this co-production even possible? What made this? What in fact are the circumstances that made it possible? I don't know the answer to this, and in fact, it's kind of one of my disclaimers in the book that I don't presume to answer this question, or even to prove that these circumstances, which is to say, sort of historically, that these circumstances were in place. I assert that on the basis of work that has already been done, and in a way, I think that the question, what made this possible, assumes that my reading of the texts is convincing, which is to say, in a previous paradigm, when we rarely think of these traditions as one that were in productive contact, that they were produced through these dialogues, we don't ask ourselves what circumstances made contact possible. We just assume that they're not there. And as we assume that it is there, we ask ourselves, wait, where did they meet? And what were the vectors? And what are the economic incentives maybe that were in place? There's all kinds of hints to that. Book markets and areas where people were in contact. But in fact, when you approach the texts and the chronicles, assuming that people who inhabit a space where more than one culture, in fact, 3 or 4 cultures are in proximity, then the opposite question makes more sense. How would they not become influenced by the gestures and motifs and strategies and plot lines, as you say, are used efficaciously? And in fact, to tie this to your first question, if anything, it makes sense that these plot lines and strategies and markers, placeholders would be used to think about the matters that are most crucial and urgent to them. So in that sense, in the end, it makes more sense to think about belligerence in this context as something that would invite these kinds of care or this kind of attention, and perhaps also in other contexts. Peacemaking, for sure. I'm sure Yvonne Friedman would have plenty to say about that. But other areas that are important as well. I don't know if less or more, but certainly for people who lived in the maybe second half of the 13th century, they paid a great deal of attention and of their energy, I think, to think about what it means to fight on behalf of the Holy Land, which is to say, what does it mean to fight, and what does the Holy Land as a category mean for them as something that yields a certain disposition, if not action. And lastly, I think with Nick, you posit this as a question, but I think it's also an argument that I think we share. Certainly, I think what this book tries to argue is that these texts, the literary devices, these plot lines, reflect a kind of willingness to, or recognition of the possibilities that lie in co-production, but they're also agents of this co-production as well. They create it, and they're born through it. And in as much as this is true in thinking about holy belligerence, and that is again very tangible in a text like Histoire d'Outre-mer that thinks about fighting on behalf of the Holy Land and thinking about all kinds of warrior figures who do that, but it is also true in thinking about the literary devices themselves, language itself as an agent of this co-production, thinking of itself as the conditions that make itself possible, or the conditions that make language intelligible, meaningful, as ones that are created through these kinds of contacts. So to me, they're as much reflections of this co-production as they are agents of it. And I thank you very much for this point, Nick. And I thank all of you for all your very helpful comments.
Thanks very much. Is there anyone who would like to comment, respond, ask? This is your chance.
I think
Don't see if anyone has raised his hand.
No, Elise says raise your hand.
Okay. Raise your hands or just...
I raised my hand, yeah. First of all, I want to say, Uri, that it's great to conclude the celebration of one book with a description of the coming and the next one. So this is really impressive that you have already well into your next book. And since I'm in Cambridge, UK at 5 o'clock, I have to go for tea, as you say, so I'll not keep you long, but I just wanted to say that I've noticed Daniela mentioned that the theme of the center this year is center and periphery. And I think I would add to the questions raised by the other panelists, the question of center of periphery with regard to your notion of co-production. And where is the center? Where is the periphery? What are we doing with what we usually regard as the center of Latin culture, which is in the medieval West? And I would not presume to present the Levant as a center of cultural, I mean, it's not as at the same level of cultural activity, but I think without even trying to answer this question, it is worth discussing it in the context of your topic this year, because I think it shows how potent the idea of co-production is when we're discussing both the Latin East and different cultures around the Mediterranean, which you do in your book. But I think it shows that there's so much to think of and so much to do furthermore with that idea.
We've actually done that. We've actually done that earlier this year with Gil Bischoff's really interesting lecture about artistic. He didn't use the term co-production, if I remember correctly, but it definitely ties in with themes that we've heard today. Yes, so also in this sense, we have some continuity. And it's always good to come back to the same ideas and questions and look at them from new perspectives. If nobody would like to add anything, I will thank our panelists again for really inspirational talks. I want to thank Raya and the Department of History. It's a pleasure to see so many faces, to have so many guests or participants from the Department of History, and we hope we will have more occasions for having events, for shared events. And I thank each and every one of you who has participated today, and hope to see you in our future events. Please follow us, our newsletter, our Facebook, our website. We meet every week for a seminar or reading group, and we will have 2 other book events this year, and you are most welcome to join again. Good night and good morning.
Congratulations, Uri.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
אורי, היה על הכיפאק, נכון?